The videotape flickers to life, revealing an exhausted, frightened teenager staring into the cold lens of a police camera. It is the spring of 1989, and the city of New York is engulfed in a state of sheer panic following the brutal assault of a female jogger in Central Park. The public pressure for swift, uncompromising justice has created a volatile atmosphere, transforming the precinct interrogation rooms into psychological pressure cookers. Inside these claustrophobic walls, 5 Black and Latino teenagers, including Antron McCrae and Yusef Salam, sit isolated from their parents and legal counsel, subjected to hours of relentless questioning. The stakes are impossibly high, and the detectives, desperate for a resolution, push the vulnerable youths past their breaking points. What emerges from these grueling sessions is a series of videotaped statements that will shatter 5 lives and define an era of judicial failure. These coerced confessions are a masterpiece of police manipulation, built on exhaustion, fear, and deceptive tactics. Detectives feed specific details of the crime to the boys, promising them that if they just repeat the narrative on camera, they will be allowed to go home. The teenagers, terrified and desperate to escape the interrogation room, comply, weaving disjointed and contradictory tales of a violent rampage. They do not realize that these recorded words are sealing their fates, forging the ultimate weapon the state will use against them. The transition from the precinct to the courthouse is swift and unforgiving. At their arraignment, the initial court proceeding where criminal charges are formally presented to a defendant, the boys plead not guilty, immediately recanting the statements they made to the police. They insist the confessions were forced, a desperate bid for freedom that has now trapped them in a legal nightmare. But the wheels of the justice system are already turning, fueled by a relentless media firestorm that brands the teenagers a feral wolf pack. The presumption of innocence, the bedrock of the American legal system, is entirely eclipsed by a presumption of guilt demanded by an outraged public. When the trials begin in 1990, the courtroom is a theater of profound tension. The prosecution's entire strategy rests almost exclusively on the videotaped confessions, presenting them to the jury as the unvarnished truth. Prosecutors methodically play the tapes, allowing the defendants' own exhausted voices to echo through the silent courtroom, painting a chilling picture of calculated violence. The state argues that no innocent person would ever implicate themselves in such a horrific crime, a psychological assertion that carries immense weight with a jury already primed by months of sensationalized headlines. Yet the forensic reality tells a vastly different and highly problematic story. The defense teams mount a furious counterattack, pointing out the glaring absence of physical evidence linking any of the 5 teenagers to the victim or the crime scene. There is no blood, no hair, no soil on their clothing that matches the jogger. More critically, the defense introduces profound exculpatory evidence, material that favors the defendant and can clear them of guilt. Semen recovered from the victim does not match Antron McCrae, Yusef Salam, or any of the other 3 boys. In a purely forensic sense, the crime scene completely excludes the defendants. To circumvent this catastrophic hole in their case, the prosecution executes a controversial legal maneuver. They pivot to a theory of an unindicted co-conspirator, arguing to the jury that the 5 boys held the victim down while an unknown 6th person committed the sexual assault and left the biological evidence behind. It is a speculative leap, devoid of physical proof, but it provides the jury with a narrative bridge to connect the boys' confessions to the undeniable forensic facts. The defense vigorously objects to this narrative acrobatics, arguing that the state is shifting its theory to fit the glaring inconsistencies of its own evidence. The defense strategy relies heavily on aggressive cross-examination of the detectives who secured the tapes. Attorneys meticulously dismantle the cohesive narrative the state is trying to project, highlighting the massive contradictions between the boys' individual statements. One boy describes stabbing the victim, another says she was beaten with a pipe, and yet another claims a brick was used. They describe different locations in the park and different sequences of events. The defense argues that these are not the testimonies of co-conspirators, but the desperate, fabricated stories of frightened children guessing at what the police want to hear. The legal battle intensifies over the admissibility of the tapes themselves. Defense attorneys raise fierce objections based on hearsay, out-of-court statements offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. Because the boys are being tried in groups, the confession of one defendant inevitably implicates another who is sitting right next to him. Since a defendant has a constitutional right not to testify, the implicated boy cannot cross-examine his accuser. The judge attempts to mitigate this by issuing complex instructions, telling the jury they must only consider a confession against the specific boy who made it, a mental gymnastics routine that is nearly impossible for any juror to perform in practice. Despite the glaring lack of physical evidence and the contradictory nature of the tapes, the psychological power of the confessions proves insurmountable. The jury delivers a verdict that sends shockwaves through the courtroom, finding the boys guilty of various charges including assault, robbery, and rape. The reading of the verdicts is a moment of devastating finality. The teenagers, who had clung to the hope that the truth of their innocence would prevail, collapse in despair as the judge hands down maximum sentences. The narrative of the prosecution has triumphed over forensic science, and the vault doors of maximum security prisons slam shut on 5 young lives. The devastating consequences of these convictions ripple through the ensuing decade. Antron, Youssef, and the others are stripped of their youth, forced to navigate the brutal reality of the prison system as convicted sex offenders. They lose milestones, family members, and the foundational years of their lives, bearing the immense psychological weight of a crime they did not commit. Outside the prison walls, the Central Park 5 case becomes a cornerstone of tough-on-crime political rhetoric, a closed chapter in the city's history that no one in power has any desire to revisit. The boys' continuous claims of innocence are dismissed as the standard complaints of the guilty, but the truth, buried beneath years of procedural finality, is waiting in the dark. In 2002, a shocking revelation shatters the foundation of the 1990 convictions. Matias Reyes, a convicted serial rapist and murderer already serving a life sentence, steps forward from his cell and confesses to the assault of the Central Park jogger. Reyes states definitively that he acted alone, providing intimate, unpublicized details of the crime scene that only the true perpetrator could know. His confession is a seismic event, a sudden, blinding light cast into the darkest corners of the judicial system. The district attorney's office, faced with this explosive claim, is forced to reopen the investigation. They issue a subpoena, a formal legal document ordering a person to attend court or produce physical evidence to retrieve the biological samples preserved from the 1989 crime scene. For over a decade, the true killer's genetic signature has been sitting in an evidence locker, waiting for science to catch up. The investigators turn to advanced DNA testing, a technology that was in its infancy during the original trial, but has now become the gold standard of forensic truth. The laboratory results are absolute and undeniable. The DNA profile extracted from the semen found on the victim is a perfect, definitive match to Matias Reyes. Furthermore, a single hair found on the victim's clothing, which prosecutors in 1990 vaguely suggested might belong to one of the black defendants, is also tested. It is a match to Reyes. The scientific evidence completely excludes the Central Park 5 and corroborates every detail of Reyes's confession. The prosecution's theory of an unindicted co-conspirator completely collapses under the weight of empirical, biological fact. Armed with this irrefutable scientific proof, defense attorneys file a motion to vacate the convictions of the 5 men. They argue that the newly discovered DNA evidence, combined with Reyes's detailed confession, proves that the original trial was fundamentally flawed and that the videotaped statements were entirely fabricated. The legal filings meticulously dismantle the state's original case, exposing the coercion, the investigative tunnel vision, and the catastrophic failure to follow the forensic evidence where it actually led. The burden now shifts to the Manhattan District Attorney, who must confront the devastating reality that his office prosecuted and imprisoned innocent children. After a thorough, agonizing review of the new evidence, the District Attorney makes a historic concession, joining the defense in their motion to vacate. He admits that the original convictions cannot stand, acknowledging that the confessions, the very bedrock of the state's case, were false and unsupported by any physical reality. It is a rare and profound admission of systemic failure from one of the most powerful prosecutorial offices in the country. In December 2002, the legal saga reaches its climax in a packed New York courtroom. The judge formally grants the motion to vacate the convictions and dismisses all charges against the 5 men. While not a traditional acquittal, a formal certification of innocence by a jury at the end of a trial, the vacatur achieves the exact same monumental legal result. The criminal records of Antron McCrae, Yusef Salam, and the others are wiped clean. The gavel falls, legally erasing the guilt that had been unjustly branded onto them 13 years prior. The emotional release in the courtroom is overwhelming. The men, now in their late 20s and early 30s, embrace their families, tears streaming down their faces as they hear the justice system finally speak the truth. The nightmare is legally over, but the scars of their wrongful incarceration are permanent. They walk out of the courthouse as free men, not because the system worked, but because the undeniable, microscopic truth of DNA forced the system to correct its own catastrophic error. The exoneration of the Central Park Five stands as a permanent, glaring warning about the fragility of justice in the face of public pressure. It exposes the terrifying reality of coerced confessions, proving that under enough psychological duress, innocent people will confess to the most horrific of crimes. The case fundamentally altered the landscape of criminal justice, sparking a nationwide demand for the mandatory recording of all police interrogations from start to finish to prevent the kind of hidden manipulation that destroyed 5 young lives. The saga remains a haunting testament to the necessity of forensic truth, a reminder that justice must be driven by evidence, not by outrage.